Olivia thought she had seen the last of Daniel, but one afternoon, as she walked out of the publishing office, she found him waiting by her car. He looked nothing like the man he once was. The confidence, the arrogance, it had all been stripped away. "Olivia," he said, his voice softer than she remembered. "Can we talk?" For a moment, she considered walking past him, leaving him in the ruins of his own making. But curiosity won. "I don't see what's left to say," she replied, crossing her arms. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "I lost everything," he admitted. "The company, the respect, Veronica." He let out a bitter laugh. "She disappeared the moment the money did." Olivia felt no sympathy. "And you expect me to feel bad?" she asked. "After what you put me through?" He shook his head. "No, he hesitated. "I wanted you to know I regret it." She studied him, searching for sincerity, but it didn't matter. "Regret doesn't undo what you did," she said simply. "I moved on, Daniel. You should too." Without another word, she got in her car, leaving him behind exactly where he belonged. The encounter with Daniel left Olivia unsettled, not because of lingering emotions, but because it reminded her of who she had been. There was a time she would have given anything for him to show remorse, to admit he was wrong. Now it felt empty. His apology didn't change the past, and she no longer needed validation from the man who once discarded her like an afterthought. That chapter of her life was closed. That night, she went through the last remnants of her past, sorting through old photographs, mementos of a life she no longer recognized. She placed them in a box, not to erase the past, but to acknowledge that it no longer defined her. The next morning, she donated Daniel's expensive gifts, the designer clothes he had once insisted she wear to match his status. It felt like shedding the last weight of his influence. When she walked out of the store, she felt lighter, freer. It was the goodbye she had truly needed. With every passing day, Olivia grew more confident in her new life. The publishing house had become more than just a job. It was a place where she felt valued, where her ideas mattered. She no longer dreaded mornings or felt the need to mold herself into someone else's expectations. She had built something for herself, something no one could take away. One evening, Evelyn Carter called her into the office. "You have an incredible eye for talent," she said, handing Olivia a contract. "I want you to consider taking on a senior editorial role." Olivia's breath caught. It was more responsibility, a chance to shape stories in a meaningful way. She smiled, realizing how far she had come. "I'd love that," she said, without hesitation. She was no longer the woman waiting for permission to exist. She was carving her own path, one decision at a time. Months passed, and Olivia found herself on a familiar balcony, gazing at the city lights. But this time, she wasn't lost in uncertainty. She had created a life that belonged entirely to her, free from Daniel's shadow, free from the pain of the past. Noah was still around, their friendship growing naturally, without the pressure of expectations. But whether he stayed or not wasn't what defined her happiness. She had finally learned that her worth wasn't tied to anyone but herself. Her phone buzzed, another author inquiry, another exciting project waiting. She smiled, setting her glass of wine down as she replied. Her life was no longer about survival or revenge. It was about growth, joy, and the endless possibilities ahead. As the night breeze wrapped around her, she knew one thing with absolute certainty: she was free. And this time no one would take that away from her. A few days later, Noah reached out again, this time with something unexpected. "I know you're still figuring things out," he said over coffee, "but have you thought about what's next? What you want to do?" Olivia hesitated. "I haven't," she admitted. "For so long, my life revolved around someone else's ambitions. I don't even know what mine are." Noah leaned back, studying her. "You used to love writing," he reminded her. "You talked about starting a career in publishing before everything." The memory hit her like a wave. Before Daniel, before she had become the woman who lived in his shadow, she had dreams of her own. She had loved storytelling, had dreamed of working with books, but somewhere along the way, she had convinced herself that supporting Daniel was more important. I haven't thought about that in years, she said, almost to herself. Noah smiled. Maybe it's time to start. He slid a business card across the table. A friend of mine owns a small publishing firm. They're looking for someone with an eye for good stories. Olivia stared at the card, feeling a spark of something she hadn't felt in years, possibility. As Olivia considered Noah's offer, another surprise found her, this time in the form of an old acquaintance. Walking through the city, she spotted Caroline Bennett, once one of her closest friends, now just another person who had vanished when Daniel left her. Caroline caught sight of her and hesitated before approaching. Olivia, she said carefully. I wasn't sure if I should say hello. Olivia gave a small, polite smile. Why wouldn't you? She asked, though she already knew the answer. Caroline sighed, shifting uncomfortably. I should have reached out, she admitted. When everything with Daniel happened, I didn't know what to say. Olivia studied her, waiting. And now that he's fallen, you suddenly do. Caroline winced but nodded. I guess I deserve that. Olivia had spent years mourning the loss of friendships she once believed were real. Now, standing before someone who had abandoned her, she felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, just indifference. I don't hold grudges, Caroline, she said finally. But I also don't look back. With that, she walked away, realizing that closure didn't always come from apologies. Sometimes it came from knowing you no longer needed them. That evening, Olivia sat in her apartment, Noah's business card still on the table. The old Olivia would have hesitated, would have second-guessed herself, but she wasn't that woman anymore. She picked up her phone and dialed the number. A few rings later, a warm voice answered. This is Evelyn Carter. Olivia took a deep breath. Hi, Ms. Carter. My name is Olivia Turner. Noah Lawson gave me your number. He mentioned you're looking for someone in publishing. There was a pause before Evelyn responded. Noah spoke highly of you. Why don't you come in tomorrow? Let's talk. Olivia hung up, feeling an unfamiliar mix of nerves and excitement. This was something she was doing for herself, not because someone else expected it, not because she was trying to prove anything. It was a small step, but an important one. The next morning, she arrived at the publishing house, a modest but charming office filled with bookshelves and the quiet hum of creativity. As she shook hands with Evelyn, she realized that for the first time in years, she wasn't trying to fit into someone else's world. She was stepping into her own. Weeks passed, and with each day, Olivia felt more like herself. The publishing job wasn't glamorous, but it was fulfilling. She spent her days surrounded by stories, working on manuscripts, rediscovering the passion she had buried long ago. It wasn't about the money or status. It was about doing something that made her feel alive. She no longer checked the news for updates on Daniel. His downfall was old news, his name fading from the headlines. He was a chapter she had closed, a lesson learned. One evening, as she sat by her window with a book in her lap, her phone buzzed. It was Noah. Dinner, the message read. She smiled, considering it. She could say yes or she could say no. The beauty of her life now was that the choice was entirely hers. With a deep breath, she typed her response. Whatever happened next, she knew one thing for certain: she was finally free. And that freedom was worth more than anything Daniel had ever taken from her. Olivia hadn't realized how much she had changed until she sat across from Noah at dinner, laughing without reservation. The Olivia from a year ago wouldn't have recognized this version of herself, the one who no longer measured her worth through someone else's approval. You seem lighter, Noah observed, sipping his wine. Like you're finally breathing again. Olivia smiled, stirring the pasta on her plate. That's because, for the first time in years, I am. Their conversation flowed effortlessly, touching on old memories and new ambitions. Unlike Daniel, Noah never made her feel small, never acted as if he was granting her space in his world. Instead, he listened, genuinely interested in the life she was building. Olivia realized that happiness no longer felt like a fragile thing to be grasped before it slipped away. It was steady, real, and most importantly, hers. Whether or not Noah remained in her life didn't define it. She was complete on her own. She had proven that she was not the weak, insignificant woman he had tried to erase. Daniel scarcely looked at her when the hearing ended. Daniel remained silent while his lawyer frantically mumbled something in his ear, perhaps about damage management. He was lost in his own downfall, drowning in the mess he had created. Olivia chose not to remain and observe his departure. Neither a last showdown nor a parting comment were necessary for her. She had already spoken everything she needed to say, by standing tall, by refusing to be shattered. As she stepped out of the courthouse, a crisp breeze hit her face. The conflict had concluded. But her life finally was beginning again. For the first time in years, Olivia woke up without the weight of uncertainty pressing on her chest. The battle was over and she had won. No longer confined by Daniel's control or the fear of losing everything, she felt a strange yet welcome emptiness. Her phone buzzed with messages. Friends who had once distanced themselves now suddenly remembered her. Although some pretended to be sorry, others pretended to be interested. She ignored most of them. In her time of need, where had they disappeared to? She redirected her attention to the future. She finally had the financial stability that Daniel had threatened to take from her in the settlement, but that wasn't her true desire. It was sense of purpose and self. For too long, she had been Daniel Turner's wife. Her value measured only by her association with him. But now she had to decide who she was beyond that. Sitting in her peaceful apartment, she realized something that astonished her. Her relentless pursuit of justice had rendered her oblivious to the question of what lay ahead. A week later, Olivia met Callahan at a small cafe downtown. Sipping his coffee, he relaxed. The battle had long since faded from his mind. He said, "You're free now." As he stirred his drink. "What's next?" Olivia hesitated, wondering how to answer. An admission of ignorance was made by her. "For years, I struggled to preserve my life from being taken away, but I never thought about reconstructing it." As if anticipating this, Callahan gave a subtle nod. "Then maybe it's time to start figuring it out." Somebody spoke up before she could answer. "Olivia." She turned and her breath caught in her throat. Noah Lawson, a longtime friend, maybe even longer than that, was standing before her. Years ago, when she became absorbed in Daniel's world, they lost contact. "I saw the news," he replied, his countenance inscrutable. "It seems like you've finally received the justice that was due to you." Something new was sparked in her by his mere presence. Realization of the passage of time, without remorse or yearning. Unexpectedly, Olivia was even more unsettled by the prospect of seeing Noah again. Before she had lost herself and Daniel, he had been a part of her life. Over coffee, they caught up, speaking gingerly, like two people trying to evaluate whether the past was best left untouched. "I always wondered what happened to you," Noah admitted, watching her closely. Olivia smiled slightly. "I got lost," she stated simply. "But I think I'm finally finding my way back." Noah thought for a moment before answering. "What Daniel did to you is something I've heard about. People talked, but no one really knew the truth." Olivia met his gaze, appreciating his honesty. The old Olivia would have brushed it off, pretended she was fine. But she wasn't that woman anymore. To hear her tell it, it was worse than anyone knows. It didn't stop me from making it. She had never before felt the impact of those words. She hadn't just escaped Daniel's grip, she had endured. And now she had the chance to live. Olivia never expected to hear from Daniel again, but his email arrived late one night, a pitiful attempt to regain control. "Olivia," it began, stripped of its usual arrogance. "I know I made mistakes. I let my ambition cloud my judgment. But you and we were something once, weren't we?" She scoffed, disgusted by his sudden vulnerability. He wasn't reaching out because he regretted hurting her. He was reaching out because he had lost everything. For a brief moment, she considered responding, telling him exactly what she thought of his attempt at redemption. But then she realized he wasn't worth it. His downfall had already been written, and she had no intention of being dragged into his destruction. Without hesitation, she deleted the email. She owed him nothing. Daniel Turner was nothing more than a ghost from a life she had left behind. And she was finally ready to move forward. Standing on her balcony, Olivia breathed in the crisp evening air. She had spent years in a gilded cage, believing that love meant sacrifice, that devotion meant silence. But now the world was open before her, limitless in possibility. She didn't need validation from Daniel or revenge to feel whole. She had reclaimed herself, and that was enough. Her phone buzzed, a message from Noah. Dinner tomorrow. She smiled, not because she saw romance in their reunion, but because for the first time in years, she had the freedom to choose. She could say yes or she could say no. Her life was her own again. With that thought, she turned off her phone and let the night embrace her. Whatever came next, it would be on her terms. And that was a victory greater than any courtroom ruling. For days, Olivia couldn't shake the realization of how silent her world had become. No more legal battles, no more calls from reporters, no more whispers about Daniel's betrayal. It was unsettling, but not in the way she had expected. She had spent so long fighting for justice that now, with the war won, she felt adrift. The scars of humiliation and loss were still there, but they no longer defined her. The absence of chaos left room for something she had forgotten: peace. She tried to fill her time with distractions, but nothing truly satisfied. Shopping felt empty, socializing felt forced. She had money now, freedom, but purpose remained elusive. One afternoon, she found herself walking aimlessly through the city, drawn to places she hadn't visited in years. She stopped in front of a small bookstore, one she used to love before her life had been consumed by Daniel's world. Without thinking, she stepped inside, inhaling the scent of old pages and ink, and for the first time in weeks, she felt something shift. Maybe the answer wasn't in grand gestures, but in rediscovering the small joys she had lost. At this very moment, his personal and financial empires were starting to fall apart. Olivia took a deep breath out as she reclined in her chair. We must ensure that she realizes the dire circumstances he is about to face. The smile on Callahan's face became wider. I was expecting you to say that. The following hearing was very different from the previous one. Instead of his customary haughtiness, Daniel strode in. As they settled into their chairs, his lawyer urgently whispered something in his ear, adding to his tension. Although Olivia had anticipated this moment, the satisfaction she felt as she watched it unfold was beyond her wildest dreams. Concerning the financial deceit, the judge did not dally. Our inquiry of Mr. Turner's financial records is being extended in light of the material that has been submitted. There will be far-reaching legal ramifications beyond this divorce if more efforts to hide assets are uncovered. Daniel discolored. A bead of perspiration was beginning to form on his temple, and not even his most expensive suit could conceal it. Olivia could have kept her composure. Daniel's fear was sufficient. Over the course of his life, he had spent a great deal of time controlling and manipulating others. He believed he could win the game, but now he was stuck in it. His flawless reputation was crumbling at a rate he couldn't keep up with, thanks to Veronica's increasing disinterest. Callahan slightly leaned in as they walked out of the courtroom. Even this is just the beginning, he whispered. With a fiery resolve in her heart, Olivia locked eyes with him. I know, she said. Plus I am prepared. It had been years since she had felt fearless. No longer was she the abandoned spouse. Daniel Turner would come to deeply regret his underestimation of her. The consequences of Daniel's financial fraud extended beyond the confines of the legal system. After first focusing on Olivia's resentment of her ex-husband, the media shifted their focus to Daniel's deteriorating reputation. His entire career was scrutinized by reporters, who questioned whether his commercial success had been based on deceit. As part of their continuous internal assessments, his board members started to distance themselves by making nebulous remarks. The more Daniel tried to control the narrative, the more it slipped through his fingers. As his life fell apart, Olivia stood by and observed. Just a week ago, he was all admired and impenetrable. Now he was fighting to maintain his empire while his name became synonymous with scandal. It was clear that Veronica, who had been his prize, was no longer by his side. Olivia couldn't help but wonder how much loyalty the younger woman truly had. She had spent years being told she was replaceable, that Daniel could do better. But now everyone could see what she had known all along. Daniel Turner was acting differently than he claimed to be. The next court hearing brought a new level of tension. As a diversion, Daniel's camp said Olivia was being malicious and trying to destroy his reputation by launching a smear campaign through the media. Callahan instinctively drew back. Mr. Turner's financial misconduct is a matter of public record, he stated. His voice calm but firm. If the truth is undermining his image, that is a consequence of his own actions. The judge was unmoved by Daniel's argument and reiterated that the investigation into his finances would continue. Olivia stole a glance at Daniel as the judge spoke. His fingers nervously tapped on the table as his jaw clenched. He could feel himself falling apart. Over the years, he had disregarded her. However, he was now coming to terms with his error with each legal hit. He had never expected her to fight back. He had expected her to keep quiet and comply. Those days, though, were past. She wasn't the lady he had discarded. She was the woman who would take all he had tried to steal from her. When a trusted friend of Daniel's betrayed him, his decline was hastened. A former business partner, eager to save his own reputation, leaked documents proving Daniel's deliberate attempts to hide assets. The court received the information within hours, and suddenly, Daniel's entire strategy collapsed. His lawyer, once so confident, now scrambled to find a defense. Olivia sat in silence as Callahan reviewed the documents, his lips curling into a satisfied smirk. This, he mumbled, is the final nail in his coffin. Daniel's face twisted in fury. He knew what this meant. From the less serious divorce proceedings to the far more serious possibility of fraud charges, the focus of the legal struggle had changed. His entire money, his career, all he had built by fraud, was now at jeopardy. Olivia expected him to lash out, to throw blame in every direction. But instead, for the first time, he gazed at her with something fresh. Fear. She met his gaze without flinching. He had meant her to be weak, but now she was the one holding all the cards. Veronica's silence had been growing, and now it shattered. Separating herself from Daniel, she issued a statement 1 week following the most recent court hearing. I had no knowledge of his financial misconduct, she declared, her carefully curated words ensuring she took no damage from his downfall. Daniel, once her prized connection, was now a liability. And Veronica Sinclair had no interest in staying beside a sinking ship. The media jumped on the bandwagon as soon as it broke, covering their relationship in detail and presenting her as the strong, independent woman who was able to discern when to put herself first. Daniel was livid. To be with Veronica was worth risking his marriage and his reputation. And now she was gone, as if he had meant nothing. Olivia couldn't help but feel a deep, undeniable satisfaction. He had called her outdated, disposable. Confident in his invulnerability, he had laughed it off in court. But now he was the one discarded, left with nothing but the consequences of his arrogance. Olivia had an epiphany while she watched the news. Daniel Turner had lost all relevance in her life. His influence in her life had waned. He was simply another man who had assumed he was invincible, and learned too late that he wasn't. The final court hearing arrived, and with it, the verdict Olivia had battled for. The judge ruled in her favor, granting her a significant portion of the assets Daniel had tried to hide. His attempts to strip her of everything had backfired, leaving him with a shattered reputation, mounting legal troubles, and financial ruin. Olivia remained motionless, taking in every word of the ruling as it was read out loud. She had won. In ways Daniel has no idea how, and not only in court. Her strength and dignity were back with her. Financial documents, offshore accounts, covert business dealings, and most damningly, proof that Daniel had been transferring assets out of his name to evade division in the divorce were all part of the package. With wide eyes, she glanced up at Callahan. "Are you sure you got this?" A small smile formed on his lips. "Daniel is sloppy because of his haughtiness, I suppose. Olivia, you are not helpless in the slightest." Olivia entered the courtroom as a determined fighter, rather than a victim, after weeks of portraying herself in that light. By sitting up straighter, she was able to meet Daniel's unblinking stare. He must have thought she would fall apart again because he grinned. However, Daniel's face transformed when Callahan rose to his feet and set the papers on the judge's desk. Beginning with a steady and methodical tone, "Your Honor," Callahan spoke. "I think it's important to look at certain financial inconsistencies with Mr. Turner's holdings before we go any further." Tension building in Daniel's jaw. He fidgeted in his chair. Olivia caught the first hint of doubt in his gaze. Plus, she experienced a novel sensation for the very first time since this entire adventure started. With any luck, in his meticulous presentation of the financial irregularities, Callahan caused Daniel's confidence to wane. While perusing the paperwork, Olivia saw the judge's troubled brow. Finally, the judge exclaimed, "Mr. Turner," in a harsh voice, "please tell me why you have moved a lot of money to offshore accounts in the last 6 months." A hint of anxiety was visible behind Daniel's eyes as he faked a grin. Even though Callahan's lawyer stepped in to defend Daniel's right to handle his money any way he saw fit, the latter remained unmoved. Callahan agreed, but only in cases when one spouse tries to hide marital assets before filing for divorce. As the courtroom whispers intensified, Olivia could see that Daniel's resolve was crumbling. The harm had already been done when he turned to murmur something to his attorney. He was starting to lose what seemed like total command. With a racing heart caused by excitement rather than dread, Olivia clenched the edge of the table. Daniel had never been on the defensive before. In order to ensure complete openness, the judge halted settlement talks and ordered an urgent examination of Daniel's finances. Olivia cast a quick peek at Daniel as the gavel sounded. Something she had never witnessed before had replaced the haughtiness in his grin. Reasons to fear. Even though Olivia walked out of the courtroom on a positive note, the battle had just begun. Later that day at his office, Callahan sat down opposite her, with papers scattered all over the place. According to his warning, this is only the start. Men of Daniel's caliber don't give up easy. Punishment will be meted out by him. Nodding, Olivia let out a sigh. Permit him. For a long time, I remained silent and put up with his indifference. I am not going to allow him to ruin me anymore. After giving her a brief look, Callahan leaned back in his chair. Very well. Why? Because there is an alternative. A folder was shoved toward her by him. Someone should have investigated Veronica Sinclair for me. Olivia opened it with a pause. Her heart raced at the sight of what she discovered. Veronica wasn't your average affluent socialite. She had a knack for showing up in the lives of wealthy men just before their luck turned south. While she emerged from each relationship unscathed and even wealthier, her ex-boyfriends and fiancés had all endured devastating financial losses. Olivia's grip on the papers became more firm. She said something about how she is more than a casual hookup. She devours her prey. Both Callahan and the other nodded. Plus, Daniel is so conceited that he thinks he can manipulate her. My gut tells me he's about to experience a harsh reality check. There was the slightest smile on Olivia's lips. Permit Daniel to believe he was impenetrable. The sensation of complete desolation would soon become familiar to him. Taking charge of the story was something Daniel had always enjoyed. In his story, he played the role of the successful entrepreneur who had outgrown his wife, while Olivia was reduced to the role of the helpless ex-wife. Still, Olivia would have none of it anymore if he dictated the plot. The news narrative changed the following day. Unveiling Daniel's hidden assets and dubious financial activities, a leak emerged, one that Callahan had meticulously planned. The one about the billionaire who got caught in the divorce fraud. Another one, Turner's shady finances revealed. While news outlets broke down Daniel's collapse, Olivia sipped her coffee. She had felt like an afterthought, an accessory to his well-planned existence for a long time. However, she now possessed the authority. As expected, Daniel was furious. With his jaw tightly clenched in barely contained wrath, he bounded into the subsequent court session. "Why do you believe this will have such a devastating effect on me?" Prior to the start of the proceedings, he spit at Olivia. "Dude, you're totally embarrassing yourself." Olivia did not hesitate to meet his intense stare. "No, Daniel," she answered calmly. "I'm ensuring that the world perceives the authentic you." Clenching his fists at his sides, he exhibited a twitching jaw. Olivia, though, had grown indifferent to his fury. For too long, she had lived in constant terror of his approval and dominance. He was now the one slipping out of control. And that was just the start. Since the divorce proceedings started, Veronica had been extremely conceited, treating her connection with Daniel like a prized possession. Her carefully built elegance started to crumble as the financial revelations spread like wildfire. From her vantage point, Olivia saw Veronica's formerly steadfast backing dwindle. Cameras caught Veronica's face going blank as she wrenched herself away from Daniel's embrace at a public occasion. "What about trusting me?" An angry Daniel's voice, captured on a hot mic, barely contained his wrath. Instead of saying anything, Veronica merely smiled tightly and walked away. The following day, Callahan gave Olivia the footage while grinning. He noticed that she's pulling away. When things become nasty with the money, women like Veronica leave. Olivia had an overwhelming sense of contentment. Instead of keeping his faithful wife, Daniel had married a woman whose loyalty was proportional to his monetary account. Olivia thought she had seen the last of Daniel, but one afternoon, as she walked out of the publishing office, she found him waiting by her car. He looked nothing like the man he once was. The confidence, the arrogance, it had all been stripped away. "Olivia," he said, his voice softer than she remembered. "Can we talk?" For a moment, she considered walking past him, leaving him in the ruins of his own making. But curiosity won. "I don't see what's left to say," she replied, crossing her arms. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "I lost everything," he admitted. "The company, the respect, Veronica." He let out a bitter laugh. "She disappeared the moment the money did." Olivia felt no sympathy. "And you expect me to feel bad?" she asked. "After what you put me through?" He shook his head. "No, he hesitated. I wanted you to know I regret it." She studied him, searching for sincerity, but it didn't matter. "Regret doesn't undo what you did," she said simply. "I moved on, Daniel. You should too." Without another word, she got in her car, leaving him behind exactly where he belonged. The encounter with Daniel left Olivia unsettled, not because of lingering emotions, but because it reminded her of who she had been. There was a time she would have given anything for him to show remorse, to admit he was wrong. Now it felt empty. His apology didn't change the past, and she no longer needed validation from the man who once discarded her like an afterthought. That chapter of her life was closed. That night, she went through the last remnants of her past, sorting through old photographs, mementos of a life she no longer recognized. She placed them in a box, not to erase the past, but to acknowledge that it no longer defined her. The next morning, she donated Daniel's expensive gifts, the designer clothes he had once insisted she wear to match his status. It felt like shedding the last weight of his influence. When she walked out of the store, she felt lighter, freer. It was the goodbye she had truly needed. With every passing day, Olivia grew more confident in her new life. The publishing house had become more than just a job. It was a place where she felt valued, where her ideas mattered. She no longer dreaded mornings or felt the need to mold herself into someone else's expectations. She had built something for herself, something no one could take away. One evening, Evelyn Carter called her into the office. "You have an incredible eye for talent," she said, handing Olivia a contract. "I want you to consider taking on a senior editorial role." Olivia's breath caught. It was more responsibility, a chance to shape stories in a meaningful way. She smiled, realizing how far she had come. "I'd love that," she said, without hesitation. She was no longer the woman waiting for permission to exist. She was carving her own path, one decision at a time. Months passed, and Olivia found herself on a familiar balcony, gazing at the city lights. But this time she wasn't lost in uncertainty. She had created a life that belonged entirely to her, free from Daniel's shadow, free from the pain of the past. Noah was still around, their friendship growing naturally, without the pressure of expectations. But whether he stayed or not wasn't what defined her happiness. She had finally learned that her worth wasn't tied to anyone but herself. Her phone buzzed, another author inquiry, another exciting project waiting. She smiled, setting her glass of wine down as she replied. Her life was no longer about survival or revenge. It was about growth, joy, and the endless possibilities ahead. As the night breeze wrapped around her, she knew one thing with absolute certainty: she was free. And this time no one would take that away from her.